Hello, my reading loves. Welcome again. Winter is upon us in most part of the world anyway, and we have a storm passing by, so you will hear some howling. And in this type of weather, I like nothing better than to read something from Charles Dickens, so I'll be doing that. And by the way, in one of these readings, you will hear the word tingled. So it seems like Charlie D knew all about tingles. Before we start, I wanted to let you know that I'm making a very soothing tea for you today. Yeah, I think it's a little bit unusual because the ingredients are not the usual one. There are no tea leaves in this tea. I have some hot water, and in this hot water I have added some banana peel. Yes, you heard me right. Let me show you how it looks. So I took the banana peel and I cut them in these small little pieces like this, and I have them inside this teapot in boiling water. So while this is brewing, we will start reading. There are 2 more ingredients, but we will add them later. So the first book that I have for you today is The Old Curiosity Shop, and I've already marked some pages that I want to read to you. And may I please remind you, my reading loves, to like and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps. Thank you so much. The place through which he made his way at leisure was one of those receptacles for old and curious things which seemed to crouch in odd corners of this town, and to hide their musty treasures from the public eye in jealousy and distrust. There were suits of mail standing like ghosts in armour here and there, fantastic gravings brought from monkish cloisters, rusty weapons of various kinds, distorted figures in china and wood and iron and ivory, tapestry and strange furniture that might have been designed in dreams. The haggard aspect of the little old man was wonderfully suited to the place. He might have groped among old churches and tombs and deserted houses and gathered all the spoils with his own hands. There was nothing in the whole collection but was in keeping with himself, nothing that looked older or more worn than he. After tea, when the door was shut and all was made snug, the nights being cold and misty now, it seemed to me the most delicious retreat that the imagination of man could conceive. To hear the wind getting up out at sea, to know that the fog was creeping over the desolate flat outside, and to look at the fire and think that there was no house near but this one, and this one a boat, was like enchantment. Little Emily had overcome her shyness and was sitting by my side upon the lowest and least of the lockers, which was just large enough for us two, and just fitted into the chimney corner. Mrs. Peggotty, with the white apron, was knitting on the opposite side of the fire. Peggotty, at her needlework, was as much at home with St. Paul's and the bit of wax candle as if they had never known any other roof. Ham, who had been giving me first lesson in all fours, was trying to recollect a scheme of telling fortunes with the dirty cards, and was printing off fishy impressions of his thumb on all the cards he turned. Mr. Peggotty was smoking his pipe. I felt it was a time for conversation and confidence. "Mr. Peggotty," says I. "Sir," says he, "did you give your son the name of Ham because you lived in a sort of ark?" Mr. Peggotty seemed to think it a deep idea, but answered, "No, sir, I never gave him no name." "Who gave him that name then?" said I, putting question number 2 of the catechism to Mr. Peggotty. "Why, sir, his father gave it him," said Mr. Peggotty. "I thought you were his father." "My brother Joe was his father," said Mr. Peggotty. "Dear Mr. Peggotty," I hinted after a respectful pause. "Drowned," said Mr. Peggotty. I was very much surprised that Mr. Peggotty was not Ham's father, and began to wonder whether I was mistaken about his relationship to anybody else there. I was so curious to know that I made up my mind to have it out with Mr. Peggotty. "Little Emily," I said, glancing at her, "she is your daughter, isn't she, Mr. Peggotty?" "No, sir, my brother-in-law Tom was her father." I couldn't help it. "Dead, Mr. Peggotty?" I hinted after another respectful silence. "Drowned," said Mr. Peggotty. I felt the difficulty of resuming the subject, but had not got to the bottom of it yet, and must get to the bottom somehow. So I said, "Haven't you any children, Mr. Peggotty?" "No, master," he answered with a short laugh. "I'm a bachelor." "A bachelor?" I said, astonished. "Why, who's that, Mr. Peggotty?" pointing to the person in the apron who was knitting. "That Mrs. Gummidge," said Mr. Peggotty. "Gummidge, Mr. Peggotty." But at this point, Peggotty, I mean my own peculiar Peggotty, made such impressive motions to me not to ask any more questions that I could only sit and look at all the silent company until it was time to go to bed. Mr. Pickwick proceeded to pour into the horror-stricken ear of Mr. Nupkins an abridged account of Mr. Jingle's atrocities. He related how he had first met him, how he had eloped with Miss Wardle, how he had cheerfully resigned the lady for pecuniary consideration, how he had entrapped himself into a ladies' boarding school at midnight, and how he, Mr. Pickwick, now felt it his duty to expose his assumption of his present name and rank. As the narrative proceeded, all the warm blood in the body of Mr. Nupkins tingled up into the very tips of his ears. He had picked up the captain at a neighbouring racecourse. Charmed with his long list of aristocratic acquaintance, his extensive travel, and his fashionable demeanour, Mrs. Nupkins and Miss Nupkins had exhibited Captain Fitzmarshall, and quoted Captain Fitzmarshall, and hurled Captain Fitzmarshall at the devoted heads of their select circle of acquaintances, until their bosom friends, Mrs. Pakenham and the Miss Pakenhams, and Mr. Sidney Pakenham, were ready to burst with jealousy and despair. And now to hear, after all, that he was a needy adventurer, a strolling player, and if not a swindler, something so very like it that it was hard to tell the difference. Heavens, what would the Pakenhams say? What would be the triumph of Mr. Sidney Pakenham when he found that his addresses had been slighted for such a rival? How should he, Nupkins, meet the eye of old Pakenham at the next quarter sessions? And what a handle would it be for the opposition magisterial party if the story got abroad? Mr. Squeeze's appearance was not prepossessing. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favour of two. The eye he had was unquestionably useful, but decidedly not ornamental, being of a greenish grey and in shape resembling the fanlight of a street door. The blank side of his face was much wrinkled and puckered up, which gave him a very sinister appearance, especially when he smiled, at which times his expression bordered closely on the villainous. His hair was very flat and shiny, save at the ends, where it was brushed stiffly up from a low protruding forehead, which assorted well with his harsh trifle below the middle size. He wore a white neckerchief with long ends and a suit of scholastic black, but his coat sleeves being a great deal too long and his trousers a great deal too short, he appeared ill at ease in his clothes, and as if he were in a perpetual state of astonishment at finding himself so respectable. Mr. Squeers was standing in a box by one of the coffee-room fireplaces, fitted with one such table as is usually seen in coffee-rooms, and two of extraordinary shapes and dimensions made to suit the angles of the partition. In a corner of the seat was a very small deal trunk, tied round with a scanty piece of cord, and on the trunk was perched his lace-up half-boots and corduroy trousers dangling in the air, a diminutive boy with his shoulders drawn up to his ears and his hands planted on his knees, who glanced timidly at the schoolmaster from time to time, with evident dread and apprehension. They went into the city, turning down by the riverside, and after a long and very slow drive, the streets being crowded at that hour with vehicles of every kind, stopped in front of a large old dingy house in Thames Street, the door and windows of which were so bespattered with mud that it would have appeared to have been uninhabited for years. The door of this deserted mansion Newman opened with a key which he took out of his hat, in which, by the by, in consequence of the dilapidated state of his pockets, he deposited everything and would most likely have carried his money if he had had any. And the coach being discharged, he led the way into the interior of the mansion. Old and gloomy and black in truth it was, and sullen and dark were the rooms, once so bustling with life and enterprise. There was a wharf behind opening on the Thames, an empty dock canal, some bones of animals, fragments of iron hoops and staves of old casks lay strewn about, but no life was stirring there. It was a picture of cold, silent decay. "This house depresses and chills one," said Kate, "and seems as if some blight had fallen on it. If I were superstitious, I should be almost inclined to believe that some dreadful crime had been perpetrated within these old walls, and that the place had never prospered since. How frowning and how dark it looks!" "Lord, my dear," replied Mrs. Nickleby, "don't talk in that way, or you'll frighten me to death." "It is only my foolish fancy, mamma," said Kate, forcing a smile. "Well, then, my love, I wish you would keep your foolish fancy to yourself, and not wake up my foolish fancy to keep it company," retorted Mrs. Nickleby. "Why didn't you think of all this before? You are so careless. We might have asked Miss La Creevy to keep us company, or borrowed a dog, or 1,000 things. But it always was the way, and was just the same with your poor dear father, unless I thought of everything." This was Mrs. Nickleby's usual commencement of a general lamentation, running through a dozen or so of complicated sentences addressed to nobody in particular, and into which she now launched until her breath was exhausted. Now let's take a look at our tea. I think the time has come to add the other two ingredients. Okay. So first we will add a very, very little bit, teensy bit of cinnamon powder. And the next thing we will add a teeny tiny bit of cardamom powder. Very little bit. And now just Mix it all a little bit. Mmm, it has a very nice aroma. Yeah, cinnamon and a little bit of banana. Oh, must be delicious, I'm sure, and effective. So I think we can let it brew for a couple more minutes. Let me set this aside. He could see the light of the fire shining through the window. Perhaps it drew him on to look in. Perhaps he had come out with the express intention. That part of the bank having rank grass growing on it, there was no difficulty in getting close, without any noise of footsteps. It was but to scramble up a ragged face of pretty hard mud, some 3 or 4 feet high, and come upon the grass and to the window. He came to the window by that means. She had no other light than the light of the fire. The unkindled lamp stood on the table. She sat on the ground looking at the brazier with her face leaning on her hand. There was a kind of film or flicker on her face, which at first he took to be the fitful firelight, but on a second look he saw that she was weeping. A sad and solitary spectacle, as shown him by the rising and the falling of the fire. It was a little window of but 4 pieces of glass, and was not curtained. He chose it because the larger window near it was. It showed him the room and the bills upon the wall respecting the drowned people, starting out and receding by turns, but he glanced slightly at them, though he looked long and steadily at her. A deep, rich piece of colour, with the brown flush of her cheek and the shining lustre of her hair, though sad and solitary, weeping by the rising and falling of the fire. She started up. He had been so very still that he felt sure it was not he who had disturbed her, so merely withdrew from the window and stood near it in the shadow of the wall. She opened the door and said in an alarmed tone, "Father, was that you calling me?" And again, "Father," and once again after listening, "Father, I thought I heard you call me twice before." She started up. He had been so very still that he felt sure it was not he who had disturbed her, so merely withdrew from the window and stood near it in the shadow of the wall. A tranquil summer sunset shone upon him as he approached the end of his walk and passed through the meadows by the riverside. He had that sense of peace and of being lightened of a weight of care which country quite awakens in the breasts of dwellers in towns. Everything within his view was lovely and placid. The rich foliage of the trees, the luxuriant grass diversified with wild flowers, the little green islands in the river, the beds of rushes, the water lilies floating on the surface of the stream, the distant voices in boats borne musically towards him on the ripple of the water, and the evening air were all expressive of rest, in the occasional leap of a fish, or dip of an oar, or twittering of a bird not yet at roost, or distant barking of a dog, or lowing of a cow. In all such sounds there was the prevailing breath of rest, which seemed to encompass him in every scent that sweetened the fragrant air. The long lines of red and gold in the sky and the glorious track of the descending sun were all divinely calm. Upon the purple tree-tops far away, and on the green height near at hand, up which the shades were slowly creeping, there was an equal hush. Between the real landscape and its shadow in the water there was no division. Both were so untroubled and clear and while so fraught with solemn mystery of life and death, so hopefully reassuring to the gazer's soothed heart, because so tenderly and mercifully beautiful. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below, and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended into a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had by one consent caught fire and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavoured to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shovelling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily if it went right and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle-deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squab and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant-blooded race, appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. So, I think the time has come when the tea is brewed. We will take a tea strainer and pour some of this tea, which is giving a delicious aroma, into this cup. So maybe we will take a sip of this lovely banana tea and sleep very well tonight. So my reading loves, I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, and see you soon.